Curtis Calhoun here with MMA News, and my next guest you recognize from the UFC, now one of the top PFL analysts. It's Dan Hardy joining me today. How's it going, Dan?
I'm really good, thanks. Really good. How are you?
I'm doing great, man. Obviously, there's just so much to talk about with the PFL right now. Obviously, I want to start with PFL Europe, which is, what you're really focused on right now. How would you evaluate PFL Europe in its first season, how it's gone so far, and kind of the outlook going forward?
It's been a fascinating process. I think we've changed and developed in leaps and bounds from one event to the next. I mean, I joined the company as an analyst at the end of last year, but as the head of fighter ops for PFL Europe, I actually started that job 2 weeks before the Newcastle event. So I was very much kind of coming into a system that was running and trying to learn the processes. And it was an amazing event. We had great performances. The roster that the guys had built was really impressive. And then, almost immediately we were rolling into Berlin, and I feel like that was another very strong event. But I felt like it leveled up, production quality, level of fighters, I just felt like it was a step up, and there's no doubt in my mind that Paris is going to be another step up again. And I expect the same thing for Dublin. I feel like we're covering a lot of distance in a small, short period of time this year.
With anything that's new, not even just in MMA, but in life in general, like there's always some sort of growing pains, right? How do you feel like fans have been receptive to PFL Europe so far? And do you feel like it's kind of PFL Europe stock has kind of risen over time?
Yeah, I certainly think it has. I mean, partly down to the actual product itself and the fact that it's different to other MMA promotions, but also because we've had a few marquee signings recently. Of course, Francis Ngannou, Jake Paul's joined us, Savannah Marshall. These are all big signings, as well as Cédric Doumbé, who's going to be headlining in Paris. Like we've made some really, really strong signings, and that will draw attention to the rest of the things that we're doing. Like, you look at these brackets that we've got going into Paris, the bantamweights in particular for me, they're very, very competitive. We've got some really, really interesting fighters across those different weight classes. And, this is our first year in the region doing shows. It's new for the fans. It's something for them to try and understand and get on board with. But what I know about MMA in Europe and across the world is that the fan base is growing very, very quickly. And there are too many fighters for the amount of shows. Like, we need more shows. So, PFL, we've only got 4 shows this year, but we'll grow very quickly. There'll be more shows and more events for the fighters and more for the fans to follow. I feel like 2023 has been a really good year, but it won't be anything compared to next year.
Yeah, this year has been kind of all about, laying that foundation for PFL Europe, right? What are some like your long-term goals for PFL Europe? Like, looking forward to next year and beyond, what kind of product do you want to see with PFL Europe?
The most important thing, and I think this is, it goes hand in hand with the PFL's format, is consistency. Like, I want to make sure that there's a consistent base for the fighters to be competing at regularly in Europe. Like, the idea is that, with PFL Europe, we identify the best talent around the region, and then it progresses onto the global roster. Currently, we've got 4 weight classes that we're having championships in. We've got bantamweights, women's flyweight, lightweight, and light heavyweight. But then, we'll change those weight classes next year. Potentially, we'll change 1 or 2. We'll add weight classes in years to come as well. And we'll have more events as well. What I would like to do is build a foundational event that has got coverage for all of the weight classes, where fighters can, they know that they join the regular season and they're going to be busy for the whole year. And if they keep winning, they're going to be a champion of Europe at the end of the year. And then these bigger opportunities, across the pond in the US.
2 fighters that I've talked to multiple times over the past year is Simeon, Powell, and Dakota Ditcheva. Obviously, arguably 2 of the biggest stars in PFL Europe as of right now. What have you made of their performances this season and kind of their potential going forward?
I think they've both shown us a different dynamic to their game earlier this year. Especially with how slick they both looked. Dakota is an excellent Muay Thai fighter. She's dominated her fights with that striking skill set. But then to come in against Malin Hermansson, who's a tough veteran, lots of experience, and Dakota to be able to take her down, take her back, and choke her out, it just brings a new dynamic to her game. And I know she's been working very, very hard on her strength and conditioning. And of course, she's always been a very conditioned athlete, but this is a very tailored approach to what she's doing, which has built her into a very big, strong flyweight. She's going to be a problem for any flyweight in the world. And I think, we may realize the potential this year in Europe, but we also may not, because we've got some other tough fighters in that bracket. And same thing with Simeon Powell. I feel like the Newcastle event for him was a bit of a realization of his capability, right? I feel like there was some pressure, and Dakota was feeling the pressure as well. But I think for Simeon, he went into the cage that night kind of wondering what his capabilities were against Muhammad Amin. And when he took him down, dominated him on the floor, I think it's giving him a confidence in his ground game that's going to make his striking even more dangerous. He's got a longer reach than anybody else he's going to fight. But the fact that now he can grapple, it makes him a far more well-rounded and exciting fighter. And it goes for both of them, really. They're on a track to stardom, in my opinion.
And obviously, I got to ask a little bit about Cédric Doumbé. Obviously, there's a lot of hype with him. Obviously, an electrifying striker, and a few fights in MMA too. What are you most excited about seeing with his PFL debut? Is it kind of his striking or kind of his development in other facets of MMA? What are you most excited about with him?
Well, I'm interested to see how he's developing his striking for mixed martial arts. I mean, there are a lot of differences. Of course, his credentials in kickboxing are unquestionable. And the thing that's exciting, I think, for the fans that are coming to watch him compete in September, on September 30th, is that he's already achieved so much. He's 31 years old, right? He's 75-7 kickboxing record, legendary kickboxer. Crossed over to mixed martial arts, still undefeated, but like really early in his career. And he's early in his career at the same time as mixed martial arts in France is early in its career. And I think they go hand in hand, because the fans they're ravenous for fighters. And Doumbé is recognizable to everybody into combat sports. So I think he's moved into MMA at the right time. And I think with this matchup, what I didn't want is for there to be Cédric Doumbé versus somebody else, right? Like for me, Jordan Zebo, I watched his career coming through Aries. He's a powerhouse. He's a phenomenal athlete. It's a striker v grappler matchup, and if we're going to see Cédric Doumbé progress to bigger things, we need to ask questions about his wrestling and his jiu-jitsu. And for me, Jordan Zebo is the best person to do that, because they've both got the same record. They're both undefeated. There's animosity between the two, which means that there's additional bragging rights and tension going into the fight, which I think puts pressure on both of them. I just think it's going to be a fascinating thing to watch, given the fact that they're so early in their career, but there is so much excitement around both of them at this point.
And I want to pick your brain a little bit. Like, if you were part of Cédric Doumbé's team, would you focus more on adapting his striking to MMA, and make that the focus, or would you make it more of a focus to work on his wrestling and his grappling?
I think a little bit of both. It's what some strikers realize when they cross over into MMA. I've seen good boxers come and train with us and good kickboxers, and they realize that the distance between them and their opponent is different to what it is in their sport. So you have to change the way that you approach some things about your skill set. Like Doumbé is used to standing in striking range and trading with people, which is really useful, because that makes a lot of MMA fighters uncomfortable, right? I mean, that's what we just saw with Strickland walking Izzy down. Like most fighters don't like to fight at that close range because they want space. The small gloves make you feel even more vulnerable, and that's something else that he has to adapt to. But the best thing to build his confidence in his striking for mixed martial arts is to know that A, he can keep it in the striking range, and B, if he gets taken down, that he can get back to his feet. I know going in there against GSP, I knew he was going to take me down, so I didn't throw any strikes. You know what I mean? It just shut my whole game down. And if he doesn't have confidence in his grappling, then his striking will suffer as well. That's the beauty and the challenge with mixed martial arts. And that's why I say he's still got to adapt his striking to MMA, because the ranges are so different.
I want to switch gears a little bit here, because obviously we have a huge PFL Championships card coming up in November in Washington, D.C. Obviously, a lot of the cards been already announced. And I got to ask you right away, what are you looking most forward to about Kayla Harrison's return? Obviously, it's been a long time since we've seen her compete. What are some of the biggest things that you're going to watch when she re-enters the cage in November?
You know, because she's not been in the process of going through fights and training camp, we're going to see a much fresher, a much more excited version of Kayla Harrison. You know, what I've realized watching this PFL format from the outside and speaking to, you know, Brendan Loughnane and Stevie Ray and, you know, Olivier Aubin-Mercier, he was just talking about vacation the whole time. You know, it was like the grind of having to go through so many fights in a short period of time, and there's no respite as well. Like I was used to winning a fight, you celebrate, you have a week where you're not really thinking too much about who you're fighting next, and then you start to focus again. But these guys, as soon as the fight's over, they know who they're up against next. It's like there's no rest all the way through the season, and you know, Kayla's done that already now. We know that she's been capable of going through the season and giving it her all. I think a refreshed version of her that's just spent the time preparing for one fight on one date, it is going to be a far more formidable version, because mentally she won't have that same kind of fatigue that she would have having gone through the whole season. And the competition is getting tougher as well now, and everyone knows what Kayla's going to do. So she's the one that's got to keep trying to stay ahead of the curve and keep adapting her own game as well.
Are you somebody that believes in, you know, kind of ring rust or cage rust at all? Or do you feel like for somebody like Kayla Harrison, you know, having competed in that season format, having that break is almost kind of a benefit now in terms of, you know, she's going to be the more fresher fighter, you know, having not going through that grind of a season?
Yeah, I mean, I think regarding the question of ring rust, I think it's really dependent on the athlete. You know, I've heard a lot of fighters say, "Oh, you know, I was expecting ring rust and I didn't feel anything." And other fighters, like Franz Malambo, is a good example. He expected to roll through that first fight, and he actually felt quite kind of sticky and disjointed in there. You know, his timing was off. But if you've been competing at such a ferocious pace like Harrison has, taking a break and having a moment to just think and breathe and like take fighting and competition off your mind for a moment, it can reinvigorate you. You know, I remember taking breaks like halfway through training camp for like a day or a day and a half, and I would just completely clear my head. And the difference that it would do for my motivation. I've got to think that the schedule that Kayla's been keeping for the last few years, it's got to be exhausting, and she's going to do well to get some rest. I expect her to look much better, much more physically imposing as well. Now she's taken some time off.
If something happens, obviously it's just rumors right now, right? Like nothing's official, everything's kind of up in the air. But if the PFL purchases Bellator and there's some sort of merger, do you feel like that could impact Harrison's upcoming free agency in terms of, you know, keeping her around, like increasing her chances of keeping her around as opposed to her going to the UFC?
You know, the issue with her going to the UFC is that they just don't have any fighters in that weight class. I mean, you know, like 155 is really where she is. She would struggle to get down to 45, and I think consistently staying at that weight class wouldn't be good for her. So, you know, I mean, we'll see. I feel, to be honest, listening to Kayla's interviews, that in her mind she's got a few marquee fights that are left. Like, I think most likely she's going to want to rematch Pacheco at some point. I think she would love to get the Cyborg fight. If there was any possibility in the world that she could get Amanda Nunes, like, I think she's checking off bucket list things now. I don't really necessarily think she's thinking about a move for the rest of her career and where she's going to go, because she's achieved so much already. It's now about taking out those key names that are going to, you know, that are going to be in the debate for pound bet up with her.
And what do you feel like the PFL needs to continue to do to keep growing and to potentially rival the UFC one day, right? Because obviously right now, you know, the UFC is the pinnacle of the sport, right? But in terms of the growth, the talent acquisition, like what are some of the things that you feel like the PFL needs to continue to do to, you know, move into that upper echelon?
Well, I mean, there are a few things, but there are a lot of plans for these things already in the pipeline. I mean, I think the Challenger Series is very important, and I think it's proved its value this year by creating talent that's then progressed into the regular season and then to the playoffs. So Challenger Series, expanding upon that, bringing in more fighters, having more cards. I love midweek events as well. So I would like to, occupy that space in the calendar and make sure that we've got plenty of MMA for people, so you're not waiting for the weekend all the time. The European expansion, of course, is it's the first of many. There'll be other regions around the world which we'll move into, and we'll set up regional titles, and they'll identify champions which will move through to the global roster. And then ultimately the global roster has to keep growing. There are certain weight classes that we don't have at the moment in the PFL. I think we're going to have to add middleweight and bantamweight at some point very soon. I think we're going to need more women's weight classes. Like, the sport is only growing, and I think that PFL need to continue expanding to accommodate the additional talent. I'm looking at the amateurs right now, and there are so many amateur fighters, and I'm thinking to myself, these are going to be stepping over into the pro ranks soon, and we're going to need to double our shows to accommodate. That's exciting. It's a good place to be, but we need to make sure we're expanding quick enough to keep up with it.
Just a couple more questions for me, man. Once again, I really do appreciate the time. I know you got a lot going on. I want to switch gears a little bit here and talk a little bit about Francis Ngannou. Obviously, I want to get to the boxing stuff too, but what do you feel like makes the most sense in terms of his PFL debut? Do you feel like the PFL should pair him up with the winner of the heavyweight tournament? Do you feel like they should go outside of the league? Like, what do you feel like makes the most sense for his PFL debut?
I think there are a lot of options, and I think a lot of it is up in the air, and it can stay up in the air for the time being because he's got the Tyson Fury fight. I think that buys everybody a little bit of time because, we're looking at, the first quarter of next year potentially for him to be back in mixed martial arts. So that gives us a few months for some fighters to, fight their way into free agency or maybe not sign long-term deals with organizations. There are lots of heavyweights around the world that would quite happily accept a $2 million offer to come and fight Francis Ngannou. The only thing restricting some people is the contract that they're currently in. But those contracts, they expire and don't get re-signed. And I think with Ngannou stepping into free agency and it paying off so well for him, I think, not only is that going to encourage people to try the same thing, but he's also negotiated the $2 million purse for his opponent, which is, you're not going to get that almost anywhere else in the world. So I think opponents will present themselves, but obviously, Goltsov against Ferreira is a hell of a fight. They're both giants. Goltsov is a lethal boxer with a really good ground game that, is more than big enough at dealing with these guys. And then Ferreira's a scary individual. I mean, you put someone who's 6'8" with an 84-inch reach at American Top Team, you're gonna have problems. You're gonna have problema. Both exciting contenders.
In terms of Francis Ngannou's upcoming boxing match with Tyson Fury, obviously going to ask a little bit about that too. On paper, obviously, there's not really a lot of people that are giving Francis, the benefit of the doubt in terms of a chance to beat Tyson Fury. So what do you feel like is his best course to pull off the upset? Like, do you feel like he just has to go for it in the early rounds? Does he have to make it kind of, almost like a dirty boxing kind of approach? What do you feel like is his best approach to the fight?
Well, I mean, of course, it's the thunderous nature of his punches, which is really going to make the difference. So, and I think that because of that, he can abandon certain game plans. Like, firstly, I wouldn't be telling him that he's going to outbox Tyson Fury. That would be a waste of energy and a waste of time. So he doesn't really need to worry about punch count necessarily. So there's not a concern that, I'm getting outpointed, because what it's going to take is one punch to change the whole outlook of the fight. And what he needs to do is optimize his chances of landing that punch. So staying safe in the early rounds and trying to figure out what obstacles you need to get around. I mean, the jab's going to be a big problem, of course. The rear uppercut, I expect to be really problematic as well, because he's expecting Ngannou to level change into that center channel where the uppercut's so valuable. So staying patient in the first round or two and just kind of finding his feet and not working too much, not being too overexcited and burning energy that he doesn't need to. That'd be the smart thing. And then anything he can get from Mike Tyson, bobbing and weaving and getting around the jab. I mean, Tyson, how many times did he fight heavyweights that were bigger than him? There's a lot of information and knowledge that he can impart, to a guy that is, Ngannou's bigger than Mike Tyson, right? Imagine if Mike Tyson's looking at him and thinking, I can give him a few techniques that work well for me. like it might just be able to get him inside against Tyson Fury long enough, put him in the corner for long enough where he can hit him a couple of times in the body and then crack him in the head. And the question is, does he get up if he gets knocked down? And he did against Deontay Wilder, and he might not against Francis Ngannou. And it's the what if that we're tuning in for.
Last question for me, man. I want to ask you a little bit about the PFL Championships card. And I want to ask you, obviously, there's so many on paper, awesome stylistic matchups. What is one stylistic matchup on the upcoming PFL Championships card that really intrigues you the most?
Oh, I mean, I could give you reasons for the majority of them, to be honest. But I mean, the light heavyweights, like the thing is with Josh Silveira, he's a very, very well-rounded mixed martial artist, right? His father was a legend. He's a legendary coach. He was a legendary fighter. Josh Silveira's got that toughness, but he's got the smarts and the maturity that comes with having that kind of lineage, that he can apply those techniques and arguably in a weight class above the one that is most natural for him. And the same thing goes for Impa Kasanganay. Like, we could learn something here, right? We've got two light heavyweights that are probably natural middleweights if we look at the regular MMA landscape, that are excelling in the weight class above because they're not cutting as much weight, right? Their skills are speaking for themselves and they're not depleting themselves before they get into the smart cage. Like, Silveira's got great kicks. He's got great jiu-jitsu. His management of distance, he's very, very clever. And he's patient as well. He knows what he's capable of, so he's not in a rush. Then on the other side, you've got Impa Kasanganay, who is, short range punches, long range punches, great in the pocket, great footwork as well, like little bumps, switching angles, kind of Mike Tyson in the pocket a little bit in the way that he bumps himself around his opponent to keep his punching options open. Like we saw what he did against Hamlet. He could do that to anybody. That's a very, very interesting matchup because Silveira's got to try and apply his technique to overcome the physical attributes that Impa Kasanganay could overwhelm him with. And Kasanganay is always growing as a fighter, so I expect him to be a better version of himself every time. And he's a real success story, isn't he, Kasanganay? He's got that on his side as well.
Absolutely, man. Well, Dan, I appreciate the time. I know you got a lot going on. Thank you so much. And obviously, there's so much going on with the PFL coming up. And all the best with the PFL Europe card at the end of this month. And I'm sure we'll connect again soon. Thank you so much.
No worries. It's been good talking to you. I'll speak to you again soon.